before we get started on this tour, I think it would be appropriate to talk a little bit about just what is a Pediocactus or a Sclerocactus. So let's start with Pediocactus. And you can see in this photograph, typical Pediocactus. It's a small plant. It has a tubercled stem. It has no ribs, and the flowers arise from the upper side of the tubercles at the stem apex. Now, very importantly, we want to take a look at the fruits. The fruits are shaped like a top, and notice that the dried flower remains are persistent at the top of the fruit. The fruit is naked. It has no scales, spines, or wool, sometimes a few scales. And very important is the method of dehiscence. So when the fruit matures, the top of the fruit, which is the dried flower remains, comes off. A vertical slit develops in the side of the fruit, and the seeds come tumbling out. So those are very important characteristics of all the plants in the genus. And this is the species in the genus Pediocactus, as described by Ken Heel, Armstrong, and Schlecher in 1981 in the Cactus and Succulent Journal. They were building on the concept for the genus as defined by Lyman Benson. He is the botanist who observed that all these plants had this consistent characteristic of the fruits that we just discussed. Before that, many of these plants had been in their own monotypic genus because the spines are so different from one species to another. And we'll see that during the program today. So I'd just like to mention that all species of Pediocactus, except for Simpsonii, are endemic to the Colorado Plateau. So let's move on and talk just a little bit about Sclerocactus. And this is a typical small Sclerocactus, and it looks a lot like that Pediocactus that we just saw. You'll notice that it has tubercles on the stem. The flowers arise from the new tubercles at the stem apex, and that the flower remains are persistent. But the fruits are not top-shaped. And when we look at a larger plant, you can see that those tubercles start to become coalesced into a rib structure. And when the fruit matures, there's two ways of releasing the seed, either through an irregular horizontal slit, like you see here, or there's a single vertical slit that the seeds spill out of. But in either case, those flower remains do not come off the top of the fruit like they do in Pediocactus. Now, one other characteristic of the plants in the species, sorry about that. So this is a spine cluster from a species of Sclerocactus. I just want to point out that there's three different types of spines. There are the shorter white spines, which are radial spines, and then there's the reddish longer spines, some of which are hooked and some are straight, and those are centrals. And then there's one very long white spine, which is characteristically flattened, sometimes ribbon-like, and it points straight upwards. So all the species of Sclerocactus have at least some subset of these specific types of spines. So let's go on to the next slide here, and we're seeing all the different species of Sclerocactus as described by Heel and Porter in the second edition of Hasseltonia back in 1994. So there's been different concepts for what the genus Sclerocactus should include since that time, and there have been ideas that include Sclerocactus, Pediocactus. There's been a lot of different combinations and recombinations and varieties and so forth. But my preference is to stick with this description of the genus. Now, the issue with the Pediocacti was understanding that all those plants belong to the same genus because their spines are so different, they look so different. That's not the case in Sclerocactus. In Sclerocactus, all the plants clearly look like they belong in the same genus. The problem is being able to distinguish some of the different species. And that's because many of them tend to integrate and their taxonomic boundaries are poorly defined. So even the authors of this Hasseltonia article admit that there's probably too many species here and that additional work is needed on the genus to really understand it. So that's good background on these two genera. But there is one other thing we need to talk about before we get started on our tour, and that is just what is the Colorado Plateau. And so on this geographic map of the Western United States, the Colorado Plateau is outlined in yellow, and you can see the state boundaries in white. And you can see that the Colorado Plateau is sort of centered around the Four Corners area where we have Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona coming together. There are, let me post some major cities on here to help you get oriented. There's Las Vegas. Up to the northwest, we have Salt Lake City. To the east is Denver. We have Albuquerque to the southeast, and in the south is Phoenix. Now, the name Colorado Plateau comes from the fact that this whole area is drained by the Colorado River, which of course runs through the Grand Canyon, which is shown in red right here. And the Colorado Plateau is one of the major geographic provinces of the United States. It's bound by another geographic province to the west called the Basin and Range. So on the north side of the Arizona Strip, just across the border into Utah, is Zion National Park, which is Utah's answer to Yosemite. It's a deep valley lined by scenic peaks, by these vertical red rock walls. There's a Kolob section that has some interesting rock formations in it. And in between these two areas is where we'll see our first Pediocactus, which is Pediocactus scleri. We see one here in scenic habitat near St. George, Utah. These plants are larger than most Pediocacti, about 6 to 8 inches tall, up to maybe a maximum of 10 inches. And here's a closer look at one, and take particular notice of the fact that the spines are fairly short, stiff, and needle-like. But as they age, they fray and form a thatch at the bottom of the plant. Now here's a photo of a plant in flower, and you can see the yellow flowers, which once they're pollinated, will form fruits. And as expected for a Pediocactus, once the fruit matures, that the dried flower remains come off, like you see in the lower left, and this vertical slit lets the seeds fall out. So I want to show a map of the area in which Pediocactus scleri grows. It's called the gypsum cactus, and I want to show you why. Many Pediocacti and some of the Sclerocactus are very particular about what geologic formation they grow on, and I'm going to demonstrate that here if we can get this slide to work. So keep your fingers crossed that all the help we can get. This map shows the area where the cities of Las Vegas, St. George, and Page are on there, and towards the bottom you can see the Grand Canyon. So the Arizona Strip is shown in blue here, and I'm going to zoom in to the area where Pediocactus scleri grows, and there we are. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post on this map some of the members of the Moenkopi Formation, and I'm going to put them there. So the Moenkopi Formation has several different members that have a high gypsum content. The Schnabkide member is shown in red. The Virgin Limestone member is shown in blue. And in between them is where the middle red member occurs. Now, you can see some obvious discontinuities in this map, and that's because of some major regional faults. Shown in black here, on the east, we have the hurricane fault, or excuse me, on the west, we have the hurricane fault, which is responsible for the hurricane cliffs. And on the west, we have the severe fault. Now, I'm going to post all the locations of Pediocactus scleri that I know about, and you can see that they all line up very precisely with these various members of the Moenkopi Formation, and that's attributable to this gypsum content that occurs in these formations. So the lesson here is that many of the plants we'll see in the program today are very specific about the particular type of rock that they grow upon. Here is a picture of Pediocactus scleri growing on some soil that has an interesting characteristic. This is called a cryptogamic crust, and it's actually a living organism, which is a mixture of moss, algae, and fungus. And this is a photo of a plant at a Bureau of Land Management monitoring site. Because this species is a threatened species, the Bureau of Land Management, which manages these plants, manages the habitat that they live in, monitors the plants at various different sites in order to assess the health of the plants. So each plant at these sites is marked, as you can see here, with a piece of rebar and a numbered tag. Here's an overview of part of one of these monitoring sites. This particular site is about 1/3 of an acre, and it's probably shows an example of a very dense colony of these plants. They're spaced about 10 to 15 feet on average, and this is a very healthy population. There's about a dozen plants in this photograph here. It's just part of that monitoring site. Now there is, I don't really know how old they are, but they're probably a lot older than you think. In fact, estimates are that the larger plants are probably several decades, up to maybe 60 years old. And then here's just a close-up picture of that occurred on the cover of the journal, the last issue, of that seedling showing the fresh growth on the tubercles at the top of the plant. It's very colorful. In the western portion of the range that these plants occur in, many of the plants are very robust and large, multi-headed, like the one you see here on this cliff. And notice the white layers of gypsum in the soil below the plant. One of the threats to these plants is off-road vehicular traffic. You can see a plant here in the photograph near the center, and there's a diagonal line across the screen. It's an old motorcycle track that barely missed the plant. So in order to help protect these plants, government agencies have put up fencing around some of the habitat areas, especially in areas where there are population centers nearby, like St. George. Okay, so I'm not quite sure where you lost me before, but I'm going to try to pick up here talking about Pediocactus publisianus, which is another one of the species of Pediocactus that grows in the Arizona Strip. So these plants are much smaller than Sclerocatus, and you can see them by their flowers in the photograph that I'm showing here. If we take a closer look at the plant, you can see that it's only about 1 inch to maybe 1¼ inches in diameter. This species is very wide-ranging. It extends all the way from south of St. George, Utah, to the east towards Winslow, Arizona. And here's a shot of another plant. And what I want you to notice about this is that the spines are very different than those that we saw on Sclerocatus. These spines are soft and corky. They have a cardboard-like texture, and they blend in very well with the dried grass in the area where the plants grow. So they're very difficult to find when not in flower. Here's another example of Pediocactus publisianus growing in a more harsh locality where the spines are very dense. Now, in this photograph, this is actually a photograph of one of these monitoring sites for publisianus. You can't really see the plants because they're so small, but what I want to point out is going on at this site. It's one of the threats. It's a natural threat to these plants, but to the right of this yellow line, the area is completely churned by pocket gophers, which have been going through the area and eating all the plants. Eventually, they moved through this entire area and destroyed almost all the plants. Here is a close-up shot showing the the very extensive burrowing that these gophers are doing. I've spoken to the BLM botanist about this, and he said that all the plants except for maybe 1 or 2 were eaten by gophers, and hopefully the population will be able to make a comeback, but that remains to be seen. Now, another plant that grows in the Arizona Strip is our first Sclerocactus. This is Sclerocactus parviflorus, and we see it growing on a mesa top behind Pipe Spring National Monument, very close to the Utah-Arizona border. Note that the spination on this plant is very dense. It hides the body of the plant. The fruits are red, indicating that they're approaching full ripeness. And this is the most widespread of all the Sclerocactus. It occurs throughout the Colorado Plateau, usually runs between about 8 and as tall as 18 inches. So if we move to the east from Pipe Springs to the Kaibab Plateau, this is where we'll find Pediocactus peridinii. This is a plant that's endemic to the eastern slopes of the plateau. And note again that this plant has very different spines than the first 2 that we saw. These spines are very long, thin, and flexible. And it does grow at a pretty high elevation in a pine forest, actually, which you can see from the pine needles on the ground around it. This is the habitat of the plant during the wintertime. It's during most of the winter, so it's a very hardy plant. And once the snow melts in the springtime, the plants come into their growth phase. They flower, they fruit, they release their seed. And then as the hot days of summer come on, the plants go into a dormancy period, and they actively desiccate and start to pull down into the ground, as you see occurring in this slide. Okay, hopefully you can see my photo of Sclerocactus sclerocatus. So This is a small sclerocactus that grows on the Berea Plateau, and it's a sclerocactus that has a preference for a particular formation, which is a aeolian or wind-blown sand. That's it's very clean. There's no fine material in it. There's almost no organic material in it whatsoever. And it's only found growing in that type of soil. Notice that this plant has the expected spine types of a sclerocactus. And it is a small plant, only about 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter. Now in this photograph, you can see that there's a whole bunch of little seedlings around the base of this mother plant. And this may be an explanation for why many of the colonies of these plants are very dense, yet the colonies are very widely separated from each other. And that is because it's apparent from this photograph that they have a very poor seed distribution mechanism. The seeds are just germinating a few inches from the mother plant. So as long as we're up here on the Berea Plateau, let's look around a little bit because there's some pretty interesting rock formations. This one is called a hoodoo. And in another area of the Berea Plateau, we have a formation called the beehives. If we travel to the south, we'll eventually come to the edge of the plateau and find ourselves at the top of the Vermilion Cliffs. And if we look out towards the east, we see the Echo Cliffs in the distance. In between the two sets of cliffs is House Rock Valley, and that deep gorge that you see in the middle of House Rock Valley was cut by the Colorado River, and it's called Marble Canyon. So the next plant that we're going to view is right on the ledges along the edge of Marble Canyon. So we're going to strap on our paraglider and zoom down and land right on the edge of the cliff there. And here we are. You can see in the foreground an example of Pediocactus bradii, which is growing on its preference for substrate, which is the Kaibab limestone formation. And in the distance, you can see the Colorado River cutting through Marble Canyon. And over there on the right is my brother. I got him to pose for this picture. I asked him if he'd take just one step closer to the edge in order to increase the drama, but I don't know why. He just refused to do that. In any case, these plants do grow in very precarious locations, like this one here, which is just a few inches from the edge of the cliff, and it's literally 1,000 feet down to the Colorado River below. So here's a close-up view of Pediocactus bradii. Once again, notice that the spines on these plants are very different from what we've seen before. There are no centrals. We only have short, thick radial spines, which almost look translucent. The plants are typically simple. In other words, they have a single stem, although occasionally you will get plants with a few heads developing on them. Now, these plants are endangered. They are federally listed as an endangered species. And so the Bureau of Land Management has set up what's called areas of critical environmental concern around the entire habitat of these plants. And the reason for that is that they can put special rules into place to help protect the plants within these areas. And as you see on the sign, the most important rule here is that everybody has to stay on the roads. There's no off-roading so that we don't kill the plants with our vehicles. Signs like this occur along the main highway wherever a dirt road leaves it. And along those dirt roads, there are reminder signs like you see here, not to get off of those dirt roads. But unfortunately, as you can see in the background behind this sign, not everybody pays attention to it. You can see there's a lot of tire tracks there. And so that's one of the big threats to these plants is this off-road vehicle traffic. But there are also natural threats. And so here we have a close-up of a plant, and it's been eaten by probably rabbits. And interestingly, you can see that the animal removed the spine clusters, made a neat little pile of them in the lower left-hand corner of the photo, and then ate the top of the plants. So herbivory is one of the most significant of the natural threats against these plants. Then one last picture of Pediocactus bradii is a really special plant that I found some years ago, most unusual because it has about 50, a beautiful plant and very unique. So let's travel now a little bit to the north, very close to the Utah-Arizona border, where there's some very beautiful rock formations along the Paria River. Also along the Paria River is a location where the very largest specimens of Sclerocactus parviflorus can be found. And this is my, he's observing the physiological characteristics of this Sclerocactus. And I'm pleased to say that Paul is now halfway through the master's program in plant science at Oregon State University in Corvallis. This is another location not far from where we just were, and you can obviously see the plants in this photograph. I came back to this location a few years later and took this photograph, the difference being that there are no plants in this photograph. They were all collected by a commercial collection operation that basically dug them out of the ground and removed every plant. Now, some people would claim that there is a seed bank in the soil and that the population could recover from something like this. But I've gone back to this location 20 years after this occurred, and there's no evidence of the population coming back. So this was a very devastating thing to have happen here. But another threat to these plants is a natural one, and it comes in the form of moths that lay their eggs on the plants, and when the grubs hatch out, they start eating the plant. In this case, it appeared as though the eggs were laid in the flowers of the plant that the grubs ate down into the fruits, and from there they moved down into the top of the plant, as you see here, and they basically devoured all the fleshy portion of the plants until there's nothing but spines left. So this is a particular problem for some of the larger sclerocacti, including Sclerocactus polyancistris, which we'll see at the very end of the program. But when these grubs are finished, all you have left is this basket of spines like you see here. So we're going to move into the area near Page, Arizona, because there's some very interesting scenic vistas there. This is called Horseshoe Bend of the Colorado River, and there's a slot canyon just to the east of Page called Antelope Canyon. It's very narrow and very deep. It's tens of feet deep, very dark in the bottom. And in order to get a photograph like this requires time exposures of over a minute. But it's interesting to go down and see all the very unusual formations that have been carved by the water. So now we are going to move into a new area of the Colorado Plateau. We're going to go to the north into the area of Capitol Reef National Park. And to get there, we're going to have to ascend what's called the grand staircase. The grand staircase is composed of 3 giant steps. The first step in the foreground is the Vermilion Cliffs. And in the middle ground, we have the White Cliffs. And then in the far distance are the Pink Cliffs. So let's go on our journey. The first step is Vermilion Cliffs. This photograph taken from House Raleigh with Marble Canyon just to my back. The second step is the White Cliffs, which you see in the background there. And this ramshackle little town you see is actually a abandoned Hollywood movie set that was put in this area. And then the third step is the Pink Cliffs. And this is where we have Bryce Canyon National Park. Very, very beautiful area. There's so many different threats to these plants, it's really a shame. This photograph is showing the water pocket fold, which is a flexure. It's a big, long, linear flexure in the crust of the earth that brings the rock formations up to nearly vertical, and that's where we find Capitol Reef National Park. A lot of very interesting rock formations to see here, as well as Pediocactus winkleri. This photograph was taken at South Desert Overlook in the national park. And in the middle distance there, you can see a geologic formation called Jailhouse Rock. So one thing to notice here is the deep flower color of this little Pediocactus. Here's a closer look at that. So Pediocactus winkleri is notable for having very woolly areoles, as you see here. However, it's actually quite variable. Here's another example of winkleri, actually in the same population as those plants we just saw. And you can see that not only is the flower color much lighter, but the areoles are not woolly. So some of these characteristics are quite variable. I want to show this picture because it's an area where Pediocactus winkleri grows. The story behind this is that I was contacted by Ian Woolnough, the fellow actually who in England who gave a very excellent talk on Pediocactus and Sclerocactus for the British Society just a week and a half ago. He contacted me several years ago and let me know that the plants at this location were just coming into bloom. So I arrived here about a week later expecting to see many, many plants, but all that was found was holes in the ground like you see at the center of this photo, where another commercial collector had come through and removed all the plants. A real shame. They actually didn't quite find all the plants, and in years since this, I've gone back and it does look like this population is making a very slow comeback. So we're going to move further to the north now into an area called the San Rafael Swell. This is another uplift in the Earth's crust. It's a dome-shaped uplift that's about 20 by 40 miles in dimension, creates these fantastic rock formations. But what we're really interested in is what grows on the flats in the foreground here, and that is Sclerocactus rhytiae. This is another small Sclerocactus that only gets up to about 3 inches in diameter, but you can see in this photograph that once again, it's got that same set of 3 different types of Sclerocactus spines. Now, interestingly, Sclerocactus rhytiae is typically white or cream-colored flowers, but mixed in occasionally with those plants, you'll find magenta-colored plants like the one you see on the left. So flower color is not a very good determinant of species. Then I threw this photograph in just to show the very scenic habitat that some of these plants grow in. So I put this in. It's a photograph of a friend of mine who is actually participating in an illegal activity. He's collecting seed from Pediocactus sclerocactus. The reason why I've included this photograph is that I feel that some of the laws that have the intent of protecting these plants actually have the unintended consequence of making them more vulnerable. And so some of these laws that say you shouldn't collect the seed result in the plants being rarer in cultivation, which increases their value and makes them more likely candidates for illegal collecting. If it were allowed to collect seed from these plants, which I don't think would hurt the prospects for the plant's survival, that would enable more commercial distribution of greenhouse propagated plants, and that would actually help protect the plants that are in the wild. Okay, this is my photograph of Kurt, who is taking a photograph of Gerhard, who is taking a photograph of Pediocactus dyspanii. So this is another small Pediocactus. It's very, very similar to Pediocactus winkleri. The flower color looks different, but we've already established that that's quite variable characteristic of these plants. It may be that Pediocactus dyspanii and winkleri will someday be determined to be the same species, just with variations that occur across a north-south climb. And here is Pediocactus dyspanii in its habitat. And look in the far distance there, those are the Book Cliffs, and that is the southern extent of the next area that we're going to visit in the Colorado Plateau, which is the Uinta Basin. The Uinta Basin is centered around Vernal, Utah, and there's a couple interesting plants that grow here. This first one is Sclerocactus brevispinus. It's a small sclerocactus endemic to the Uinta Basin, and the reason for the name brevispinus is that it has an abbreviated set of spines, as you can see here, mostly just radials, but if you look closely, you'll see that a few of the areoles have a single short hooked central spine on them. Here's a little group of Sclerocactus brevispinus. They get up to about 3 inches in diameter. So while in the Uinta Basin, an interesting place to visit is Dinosaur National Park. There's an amazing abundance of dinosaur bones in the Morrison Formation, which is those white rocks that you see there in the distance. There's a display at the park where these rocks have been turned up on their end, and they've removed the overlying layers to show the incredible abundance of dinosaur bones that occur in this in situ situation like this. It's really amazing. Another plant that grows in the Uinta Basin is Sclerocactus glaucus. Here we have an example of one that's growing in its typical habitat of gravelly soil right at the break of slope on a river terrace, in this case overlooking the Duchesne River. If we take a closer look at the plant, you can see why it's called the Uinta Basin hookless cactus. Okay, well, it's not completely hookless. Some of these central spines have a little bit of a bend to them, but that's one of the characteristics of this plant. It has two different population centers. One of them is in the Uinta Basin, and there's another population center in western Colorado, which we'll visit pretty soon. And you'll notice that the plants look rather different between the two locations. And because of that, the plants in the Uinta Basin have been proposed to be called Wetlandicus, and I think that there's some sense in doing that. So another place to visit while in the Uinta Basin is called Fantasy Canyon. It's an amazing location where a very unique erosional style of the sandstone occurs. I don't know of anywhere else in the world where you can see something like this. It's very, very different. Worth the visit if you're ever up in the area. And then one final plant that we want to look at while we're in the Uinta Basin is Pediocactus simpsonii. This is the type species of the genus, and by far it's the most widespread of all the Pediocacti. Grows all the way from the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, through Utah, up into Wyoming, Idaho, and westward into Oregon and Washington. So this is one species that's very unparticular about the rock type that it grows on. These plants are typically about 3 inches in diameter. And here's another example. This plant is growing at a location called the Desert View Viewpoint in the Fish Lake Mountains. This is at about a 9,000 foot elevation. Many of these plants grow in high elevations like that. They're very cold hardy. And in this particular location, the colony of plants is so dense that it's almost impossible to walk through this area without stepping on a plant. So continuing on our journey clockwise through the Colorado Plateau, we're now going to head south along the eastern boundary of this area into the area around Moab. This is the area of Canyonlands and Arches National Parks. It's very scenic. This photograph is of Canyonlands. It was taken from a place called Grandview Point at the southern end of a mesa called Island in the Sky. Also in this area is Arches National Park. This is where the iconic Delicate Arch occurs. This is really one of the most surrealistic places I've ever been. It just doesn't look real at all. It's a short hike to get up to this, and very much worth the effort if you're ever in the park. But Arches National Park isn't just about arches. There are also some big red rock walls and some interesting balanced rocks. To the east of Arches National Park, in western Colorado, in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, we can find the second population of Sclerocactus glaucus. Here's a closer look at these plants, and you can see that they do look quite different from the plant that's been proposed to be called Wetlandicus up in the Uinta Basin. So they're small globular plants. They have prominent tubercles or incipient ribs. And here is another view of these very different looking plants. And you can certainly see that their central spines are unhooked in this case. So we're going to continue south now into the Four Corners area. This is Indian country. It's a great place to see ruins from past civilizations. These are Anasazi houses at an area called Hovenweep. They're built on the edge of a canyon looking down on the agricultural areas in the bottom of the river valley. This is Canyon de Chelly. And one of the largest ruin complexes is Chaco Culture, south of Farmington, New Mexico. And of course, most everybody's heard of Mesa Verde, one of the most famous of the ruins. And so the next plant we're going to see is actually named after Mesa Verde, and that is Sclerocactus Mesa Verde. We see it here growing on the most unusual geologic formation, which is the Mancus mudstone. It's one of the only plants that can survive on this formation, as you see here, and it's a most unusual type of formation for a cactus, especially to be growing in a mudstone. So these plants get up to about 3 inches diameter. This plant, the photograph of this plant was taken after recent rainfall, so it's really pumped up. And take a look at those spines. They're very reminiscent of Sclerocactus brevispinus, which we saw in the Uinta Basin, apparently just radials without any centrals. However, there are some plants which, like brevispinus, have a few hooked central spines on a few of the areoles, as you see in this photograph. So here's another, this is another one of those incredible plants. It's a kind of a once in a lifetime plant. This is a crest of Sclerocactus Mesa Verde, and it has on one side about 20 offsetting heads. It's all about the size of a soccer ball, just not the typical thing you sort of see. So from this area, which is near Farmington, we're going to head up north to the border of New Mexico and Colorado. And right on the border is where we'll find the smallest cactus that grows in the United States. And that cactus probably also has the smallest range of all cacti in the United States. And that is on these little hills in the middle ground of this photograph. So this is Pediocactus knowltoni. And in this photograph, I'm going to help you find the plants growing in this cobbly formation. They're circled here. They're very small, difficult to see. And of course, you have to be in just exactly the right area to even find them, which is a challenge in itself. So here's a closer look at Pediocactus knowltoni. Notice that it has very weak radial spines, no centrals, and the diameter of the plant is just about the same as the tip of your index finger. They're very, very small. They do frequently cluster, as you see here, and the Nature Conservancy has assisted in helping to protect these plants by buying up a lot of the habitat that they grow in and fencing it off to protect them. So we're going to head south from where that plant grows into the area near Navajo Dam, a little bit to the south in New Mexico. And this is where we'll find Sclerocactus cloveriae. This is a medium-sized Sclerocactus. You can see it here in this gravelly soil. There is a subspecies of this plant called Brachii, and it was named after Stephen Brack, the ex-proprietor of Mesa Garden Nursery. This is a little bit closer to Farmington. The plants here are smaller than subspecies cloveriae, and they flower at a much younger age. Let's head to the west now, into Arizona and into the Painted Desert, which has some very beautiful vistas in it. This is the area where the Petrified Forest National Park is. And here's an example of that colorful petrified wood. It's in this area that Sclerocactus whipplei grows. Another medium-sized Sclerocactus, one of the very earliest to be described back in 1857. And this plant is notable for that upward pointing central, because in this species, it's very broad and especially thin. As you can see in this photo here, it's backlit and all those spines show up very well. So this part of the country has some well-known scenic areas in it, like Monument Valley and the famous Balanced Rock near Mexican Hat. And that brings us to the conclusion of our tour of the Colorado Plateau, but I do want to take a little bit of time and show you a few of the plants that grow in the eastern Great Basin province and the Mojave Desert. So the first plant we're going to take a look at here, and these plants will all be sclerocacti now, but the first sclerocactus we're going to look at is Sclerocactus spinoceor. Here we have a photo of it growing north of Richfield, Utah on the Wasatch Plateau. Here's the close-up look of the plant, and it's identifiable by the black central spines that you can see in this photograph. Some of these plants can be quite small and, excuse me, and actually pull down into the ground under dry conditions, rather similar to what we saw going on with Pediocactus paradinii on the Kaibab Plateau. Little plant here. Here's a close-up view of it. It does get its name from the fact that the spines have a fine pubescence on them. I'm not sure if you can see that in the photograph, but they're slightly fuzzy. It's a small plant, about 2 to 3 inches in diameter, but they can get up to about 6 inches. Now, another plant that grows in this same general area, a little bit further though to the west, is Sclerocactus blainii. It's growing here in eastern Nevada, and it's recognizable by this very long backward arching central spine that you see in this photograph. These are small plants ranging from about 1.5 to 3 inches in diameter. This is a photograph of one growing in a cryptogamic crust, much like we saw Pediocactus scleri growing in. And now we're going to move on to the final area of exploration in our trip, our armchair trip today. This is the southwestern portion of the Great Basin near Tonopah, Nevada, extending south through Death Valley into the Mojave Desert of California. And so the two plants that we'll see here is Sclerocactus niensis. You can see the flowers of the plant in this slide. It's growing in a very specific geologic substrate. It's a very coarse textured volcanic Okay. So this is another location that Sclerocactus niensis grows in south of Tonopah, where there's a lot more vegetation in the area. And it's very difficult to find in these situations. You can see in this photograph that if this plant was not in bloom, it would be very difficult to see. The spines just blend right in to all the dried grasses in the area. And then finally, on to the last plant in the program, and that is Sclerocactus polyancestris. We see an example of one here growing in Death Valley. I really think that this is the most beautiful of all the plants in the program today. This species has these beautiful, brilliant white spines, these purple and red centrals, and it has these very beautiful magenta flowers. So here's a photo of one that's backlit, showing the spines off very well. And there is an area in the El Paso Mountains, just to the east of Red Rock Canyon in California, where the plants are blondes. That is, they have all white spines like you see in this photograph. So with this, I'm going to bring the program to a conclusion with a nice sunset photograph. This is the end. And thank you very much for attending. And I certainly apologize for all the technical difficulties that we've had today, but I hope you have enjoyed the program anyway. So there we go.